So people will tune in and listen to, all the terrible news that's, about to befall them. And when you sort of step back and open yourself up to other points of view and optimistic points of view, you realize that the world is, in spite of what we're going through today, we're way better off than we were, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, with the advances that, that have been made, there's not a really good reason not to be optimistic. And I think as an entrepreneur, you have to be, you go into something thinking you're going to succeed, or else you wouldn't do it.
Let's discover the Cleveland entrepreneurial ecosystem. We are telling the stories of its entrepreneurs and those supporting them. Welcome to the Lay of the Land podcast, where we're exploring what people are building in Cleveland. I'm coming to you live from Cleveland. Today, I had the pleasure of speaking with Lee Zapis. Lee was the former president of Zapis Communications, which had owned and operated WZAK and other radio stations across Cleveland, Akron, Youngstown, as well as Atlanta and Boston. And under his leadership, through a transition to focus solely on what was coined as urban contemporary, a blend of R&B, of smooth jazz, and of pop, WZAK had become Cleveland's #1 radio station when it was ultimately sold in 1999. Between then and now, Lee continued his entrepreneurial journey, founding a multitude of other successful Cleveland-based companies. And in parallel, on the investing side, he had formed Zapis Capital Group, where he's investing in companies, many of which we will have and will feature on this podcast across Northeast Ohio, spanning technology, healthcare, real estate, and media. We cover a lot of ground in this conversation, and I think you all will enjoy it as I did. So without further ado, here's our conversation.
My father had started in the radio business in 1949, but as a hobby, not really as thought of it as, ever to be a full-time business. He and my mom did a radio show for many years, and then in the early 60s, started an FM station here in Cleveland with a few other partners. And then over the years, I kind of grew up around the business, and I always joked that it was no different than friends of mine who grew up in the restaurant business. It was just, they'd go and hang out, and they'd kind of see the way things ran, and you sort of observed. And so that was me with the radio business. And I stayed in town and went to Cleveland State, got a degree in communications. And then in the early 80s, we switched the format of WZAK, which was our station, from nationality broadcasting to an urban contemporary format. And it's been urban ever since then, 1981. So, and it's still ranked one of the top stations in the city and recognized as one of the leading stations in the country. And that's why I lived in Atlanta for a while. We bought a station down there for a while. We owned it for about 4 years, and that's why I moved down there to run it. And it was also an urban station called KISS 104.1, it was called. And we were competing with V103, which was the big legendary urban station. It was a lot of fun. In hindsight, I wish we would have kept that station, because Atlanta, like I said, has been growing like crazy. But we've done okay. Radio in Cleveland is really kind of considered the entertainment business. I always joke with my friends who worked in LA radio that they were kind of on the bottom of the food chain when it came to entertainment. You had movie stars out there, rock stars, TV stars, all kinds of people. And then you had radio. Whereas in Cleveland, all we really had was radio and maybe some of the local news celebrities. But we were at the top of the entertainment food chain here in town. So it was a great time, great industry, great way to be exposed to a lot of different things in business. Early on in the history of the life of the station, we hired two key people, a gentleman by the name of Mike Hilber, who was our sales manager, who was extremely effective at his job and kind of drove the beginning success of the radio station. And then a few months later, we hired a guy named Lynn Tolliver, who was our program director and did mornings, did afternoon. He was a very, very well-known air personality, and he built a really great team around the programming side. And, Lynn and Mike were together with us from basically a year after we'd switched the formats till the time we sold in the station in 1999. So that was really the key to our success, having a real strong group of managers, whatever you want to call them, and then the staff that they each assembled underneath them. That was really kind of the linchpin of our success, is the people that we had working at the station. And there were some really very, very talented people. That made the whole difference in that business. Because the reality is, every radio station, if you're in a specific format, has this access to the same music, the same weather forecast, the same whatever. It's the people that you assemble that present that content that makes the difference. And I'm still a big believer in radio and local radio. Streaming is fantastic. It's, another great option for people. But when you listen to a radio station, you think of yourself as listening to you're part of a community, and there's a joint shared listening to that radio station. You might not be together the same place to listen to it, but you are listening, to the same, to linear programming. And I think that's really makes people feel connected to the station. And again, the people that are presenting that music and programming is the key to that success.
If the content isn't the differentiating factor, when you talk about growing and building this to be the best in Cleveland's top station, how did you go about, differentiating yourself in the business to build that team, to attract the talent, and to, propel yourself to where you guys ultimately, built it?
I think, back then the term corporate culture really wasn't, widely known, or maybe it wasn't even known at the time. I don't know when that term was coined. But there was, in hindsight, you look back on it, there was a corporate culture that we had developed, and it stemmed from my father on down. I mean, it was a family business, and we took a lot of pride in it, and, it was kind of our family identity. We had a philosophy, or my dad had a philosophy that permeated from the top down, that we didn't, you wouldn't ask somebody to do something that you wouldn't do yourself. And I think that was an important part of our success. We had a great team, and I think we had a warm and inviting environment. We had a very diverse staff, young and old, black and white, Latinos. I mean, there's just a lot of respect for everyone and what each person brought to the table. And I think that's really what helped attract and keep talented people.
Yeah. What role do you think that, family played in your growth as an entrepreneur and in the business? How was it, working in the family business with your father, and how does that add to the dynamic, I guess, of the work you were doing?
I think, my dad was always very entrepreneurial minded. He was always open to new ideas, trying things. He had the attitude, well, if that guy can do it, so can we. He never had any limitations. Both he and my mom never said, oh, you can't do that. He was always very open to new ideas. And I think that rubbed off on me. And he was a perpetual optimist. He was very optimistic. And I think I've become more optimistic as I've gotten older. And I think, that all came from him. And, from a family business, it's like a double-edged sword. A lot of people were like, oh, you're lucky. You work in the family business. And, there's a lot of benefits to it, but there's also the downside is that if you screw up, it's not just your job that's, you're going to lose. You could, put the whole business out, put the company out of business, and then you've got
right.
a whole family that's kind of depending on it, not to mention our family, but other people's families. So there's a lot of interesting dynamics in a family business. And I think for it to be successful, for a family business to be successful, I think you always have to keep growing and giving people new opportunities, or else there's really kind of, it stymies their, upside. So you need to be able to, constantly innovate and expand the business to be able to grow and give people, not only in the family, but outside the family, new opportunities. And that's what we tried to do with adding new markets and trying to grow and expand. And so that was one of our key differentiators.
I feel like optimism and entrepreneurship are kind of two sides of the same coin in a lot of ways. And I'd love for you to just expand upon what you mean by you feel you've gotten more optimistic as you've gotten older.
I think, when you're younger, so it's easy to be cynical and think you're, clever and being, I'm just being realistic. No, you're not. You're being pessimistic. You sort of have to have this, optimistic attitude. I heard a great line recently. Somebody said, nobody's ever written a book on how to be a pessimist. It's kind of a fundamental human condition. I've heard people talk about sociologists and anthropologists about how, they talk about why bad news spreads faster than good news. It's because, we're wired that way. So thousands of years ago, it wasn't important to hear about what a beautiful sunrise it was. It was important to hear, hey, there's a bear lurking in the woods, and if you're not careful, it could kill you. And then also, I think from that stems being pessimistic, like, oh, woe is me, the world is going to end, and we're never going to go back to normal. You hear a lot of that, during the this whole pandemic thing, whether, we're doomed. And, if you watch media, local media or national media, the news, I mean, their whole business model based on getting people scared and worked up. And, so they tune in, so people will tune in and listen to, all the terrible news that's, about to befall them. And when you sort of step back and open yourself up to other points of view and optimistic points of view, you realize that the world is, in spite of what we're going through today, we're way better off than we were, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, 30 years ago. I mean, with the advances that, that have been made, there's not a really good reason not to be optimistic. And I think as an entrepreneur, you have to be, you go into something thinking you're going to succeed, or else you wouldn't do it. And I think as an investor, you're optimistic that something is going to succeed, or else, if you weren't, then you shouldn't be investing anything. I was talking to somebody today for coffee. We were talking about entrepreneurialism, and the fascinating thing about it is that you have to be, if you're not optimistic, then it's probably, you should just get a regular job where you can do whatever and collect a paycheck. But as an investor, if you're not optimistic and you do your due diligence and go very much, do as much due diligence and study things, call people, do whatever. I mean, the reality is you should never do an early stage investment, because 90% of them fail. But it's that 10% that succeed. And that's what most people are betting, that their investment is going to be one of those 10% that succeeds. I think optimism is a great asset to have as an entrepreneur or as an early stage investor.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. The general belief that the future and what you're working on or investing in from the investor or entrepreneur's perspective is going to be better in some degree than the present is kind of at the heart of, to me, like what it is to try and build a company or invest in someone trying to build a company. We'll get to, how you approach investing and kind of the work you're doing at the moment. But I'd love to just kind of paint the picture of how it was that you went from, building WZAK to be the station that it is, and ultimately, exiting that and your journey from the role of entrepreneur to investor. Why did you leave Zapis Communications? What was your thought process, and how did you ultimately come to the world of investing?
Well, I've always had an interest in technology and the application of technology to, and at the time it was to the radio industry, and there was experimenting with new ways to get audio from one place to the other. And in Cleveland, we are fortunate, and we're fortunate to have a company that was based out of here called Telos, Telos, run by a guy named Steve Church. And Steve was quite the visionary and an engineer, and just, brilliant guy. Luckily for me, his offices were right below ours when our offices were on Superior and 17th Street or 18th. He was the first guy in the world, to my knowledge, that licensed MP3 technology from this Fraunhofer Institute in Germany. And he licensed it to be used in broadcast equipment. But he also developed a codec to do audio over the internet. He introduced me to this MP3, and I'm like, holy shit. I knew it was going to be, really revolutionary, but I had no idea it was going to be turned into what it had, has turned into. So I had this interest in technology from being introduced to it from Steve Church and his partner, Frank Foti, who still is running the company. Steve unfortunately passed away a few years ago. So I got interested in that. And we were the first station to use digital audio workstations, storing our audio on hard drives. And back then it was like hard drives were very small and very expensive. But I used to get a magazine called Red Herring, which was like the magazine of the internet age, covered all the different internet companies. And it was during the .com boom. And I went to a Red Herring conference in Atlanta. It was part of Comdex, and it was kind of like a Shark Tank pitch. I mean, business would get up there and present to a bunch of different investors and say, hey, schedule another meeting and decide to invest. And I met two gentlemen there. They were sitting at a table and they knew each other. They were both from Silicon Valley, and I came in. They welcomed me to sit with them. They kind of really were helpful to me in kind of teaching me the whole, technology investing side of the business. So one guy, David Bloomberg, he's still I still stay in touch with him, not as regularly as I used to, but he's in BC out in Silicon Valley. And at the time when I met him, he was specializing in emerging Israeli technology companies. And then the other guy was a guy named Thanos Triant, and he was a CTO, I think, I'm trying to remember, at some big companies, and he was off doing technology investing. And they were, very helpful to me, showing me the ropes. And I made my first investment back in 1986 with a company at the time. It was called Snap Technologies, nothing to do with the current Snap people. But they ended up changing their name to Embark, and their whole business was working with MBA programs to manage their online application process. And this is today it sounds like pretty mundane and lame, but back in 1996 it was pretty revolutionary. A lot of things were being moving online, and so that was my first taste of technology investing. And that company, it didn't do as well as we hoped because the dot-com bubble burst, and they had missed the window to go do an IPO by just a few months, and they ended up being acquired by Princeton Review. But I stayed in touch with the founders of the company, and one guy I still talk to on once or twice a year. The other two I haven't talked in a while, but I had a good relationship with them, and that sort of started me on the whole technology investing. So I've made a lot of mistakes along the way, but have had some nice successes. And in this business, it's and I remember this was one of the first things David Bloomberg taught me was that I said, how can that possibly work? How does that make any sense when you only have one success out of 10? And he laid it out for me with the example. You got a $10 million fund. You put $1 million in 10 different ventures. 3 of them go bust. 3 of them sort of break even. 3 of them give you a 2 or 3 times return, and you're still in the hole. But the 10th one returns 100 times to 1, and it's made up for all your failures and then some. And everyone thinks you're a genius. So that's kind of like the model, and that's kind of the what I kind of try to do.
Yeah, building on that model, because that's kind of from the numbers perspective, how it plays out in terms of quantity of deals you're investing in and the expected outcome of those. But in terms of the approach that you take when you are thinking about which companies to invest in and ultimately which companies not to invest in, it's more I would imagine than just a random numbers game when it comes to your decision making process. And so, how is it that you think about the thesis, the philosophy of Zapis Capital? How is it that you're thinking about companies here in Cleveland, and the approach that you're taking when in both your diligence and deal flow, looking for companies and as companies approach you?
My deal flow is kind of, I have decent deal flow here in town. It's, to be honest with you, I don't know how people find me, but here in town, we're, fairly active in the whole early stage investing space. And so we get to look at a lot of different deals. And for us, it comes down to the people for sure. We're a big believer in the jockey instead of the horse. You need the horse too, but, you can have the greatest horse in the world, but if the jockey isn't skilled, you're not really going to have much success. We want an opportunity to make 10 times our investment. Not that it always works, but we've had a number of them that have returned that. We prefer software as a service. We like that model, B2B software as a service. We like to invest in companies where we think we can add value beyond just writing a check and, getting an update every 6 months. We want to get involved. So, some of the companies that I've invested in the past, I've, attended trade shows with them, worked a booth, gone on sales calls, done pretty much what I could to help these entrepreneurs be successful. And those were younger guys that were kind of early on in their careers, so I was able to lend, a little bit more credence, that with Charlie Lougheed's company, there's not much I can add to his group, but, that's an example of, betting on, I like Charlie's idea and I like Charlie. I've known him for years and I think he's, going to be successful because he's just got that drive. Some people call it grit. Some people just, they're relentless. One of my favorite entrepreneurs and a woman I invested in a number of years ago, Kara Katz, got a company called Playlist, although we're, playing around with that name. And she is relentless. She will not let any she's dealt with all kinds of adversity around the company. She's like a pit bull. She will not let go, and she will shake whatever until something comes loose. I mean, she is just a terrific entrepreneur. And again, optimistic. And because if she wasn't optimistic, she would, the things that you end up coming across, would probably, most people would just kind of throw up their hands like, shoot, that's it. I can't go any further. And I've talked about that too. And kind of when I look back at my radio career, we had all kinds of crazy things happen. We actually had a workplace shooting years ago that was just one of the more horrific things that I've ever had to deal with. I said to somebody, if somebody were to say to me 5 years before that happened, or 10 years, whenever we started the company, that you would have this and this and this, I would have, maybe at the time I would have said, gosh, I'll never be able to get through those kind of things. That's just crazy. Let's just give up now. You don't want to look too far ahead into the future and get yourself all worked up. You just have to think every day is going to be better than the next or the last one.
Yeah, it sounds like people have been, when you think about success, both from your time as a builder and what you look for as an investor, really one of the most important things to you. I'm curious how you gauge, people and grit and those qualities when either you're trying to build a team or you're looking to make an investment. What is it that you're looking for, and how is it that you're gauging the qualities that you're looking for in those kinds of people?
It's hard to measure it. You sort of get a sense after a while. But I like people that seem like they have something to prove to themselves or to somebody else, kind of like having a chip on their shoulder, in the sense that I'm going to succeed and nobody's going to stop me, and I'm just going to, grind it. It's like there's all kinds of cliches that you talk about. It's not how many times you fall down, so many times you get up, those kind of things. I'd like to think that I have a sense of somebody's grit when I meet them and get to know them. First of all, I have to like the person. If I'm going to be investing with them and I'm going to be spending a lot of time with them, I want it to be somebody that I enjoy talking to. And so, that to me is key. It just comes from a certain sense of having done it for a while. And of course, Rich Von Giorno, who's my partner and our CFO, he's a huge resource. And I think he helps on the people side as well, kind of judging. And my wife's great too. she's been helpful. And a few times I haven't listened to her, I regretted it, and that she saw something that I didn't pick up on. One of the things I've had a problem in the past with, as far as when it comes to people, is, and I think I've learned the lesson, but I maybe fall in love with an idea and then thought that maybe I could fix the people that were trying to execute the idea. And you really can't fix somebody in a startup kind of environment, because the time is limited. There's only so much money, there's only so much time you have to make a go of it. So you can't really spend your time trying to get somebody on board that maybe isn't the right fit.
Yeah, what you had said earlier, I don't remember where I read this, but I think the phrase was, chips on shoulders put chips in pockets.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's something to be said for it. I think just, that's why I also like immigrant entrepreneurs. A lot of them come here feeling like they have an opportunity that they have to take advantage of. So I think that's a big part of the immigrants' successes in this country.
Yeah, I think that's actually a good segue. I want to tie back into Cleveland specifically for a moment. If you had to make a request for startups in Cleveland, what is your request for startups in Cleveland? And just to add some context, at least in terms of where I'm thinking about this question, like talking to entrepreneurs here in Cleveland, I think there is, from a venture capital perspective, it feels to me like lack of access to early stage capital is cited often as a prevailing ailment of the space and ecosystem here. And so, I'm curious your perspective on limited access to capital and early stage funding in Cleveland. But from your perspective as an investor, what is it that you wish, more people were working on here specifically, or things that from the entrepreneur's perspective that they could, be thinking about or focusing on? And yeah, I would just love to hear your take on that.
Well, Cleveland's always had that rap of having not a very healthy early stage funding sources. And I don't think it's gotten any better, maybe even gotten worse over the years. I know Columbus has done, seems to have done very well. They have Drive Capital down there, which has been very successful. They've had some big successes. And we've had some big successes here in town too. But, they didn't really kind of create this large number of, cap table wasn't such that dozens of people became multimillionaires because of a successful exit. And that sort of helps feed the ecosystem, and I think Pittsburgh has had that success because of Carnegie Mellon, and they, kind of early on, they were more advanced than we are. And I think that's still probably the case in Pittsburgh. So I think it'd be nice to be able to have more angel and early stage investors here in town. There's lots of money here. It's just, for whatever reason, there hasn't been a huge appetite to do early stage investing other than the North Coast people, North Coast Angel Fund and those in their funds. Jumpstart's done their thing. But other than that, there's really not too many people doing it. And I think that would really, be helpful. Scott Shane is working on something. Bill Manby down in Akron is working on something. There's a lot of people doing things. Maybe I'm just not I'm just not hearing about the deals like I used to. I think it would be helpful for the community and as a whole if there was more money for early stage investing.
Why do you think that is the case? If there is capital to be deployed, and then, there are people here building startups, it feels kind of like a chicken and egg problem to some degree of what comes first. But it sounds like both pieces of the puzzle are there.
It is kind of perplexing because, Jumpstart's been at it for a long time. I mean, they do a great job of advocating for the startup community and the technology community. And, and maybe I'm limiting myself to just looking at, technology and software investing. I've always just liked that model, the whole kind of build it once and sell it 1,000 times or 100,000 times versus, a piece of hardware that needs a lot of capital intensive. Although that was that Mr. Beam? That was nice success. I don't know the gentleman who was behind it, but they're the ones I think that sold to Ring, and then Ring was bought by Amazon. Is that the way it went?
Yeah. I do recall hearing about that.
Yeah, that was a couple of years ago. And then, of course, RV Share has had great success. They just raised another $100 million, and within 3, that was another $100 million raise. I mean, shit, in my world, $100 million would be a nice exit. So there's people and there's talent here. And perhaps if some of those companies are successes, say for, eventually RV Share will end up being sold and the founders, whatever, will see a big payday, and perhaps they'll be motivated to help the Northeast Ohio startup ecosystem by, maybe creating a fund. And again, that's, it would be nice, but you can't really count on that. And so the people have to kind of do it themselves and, go outside of Northeast Ohio and look for capital. Stan Garber and Alex Yakubovich, who did Scout, I mean, when they were ready to start Scout, they came to see me and they were, willing to raise money at a certain valuation. And I thought it was too high. And like I tell every entrepreneur, early stage valuation is more of an art than it is a science, And, they went out to California and they got a bunch of money early on at a much higher valuation than I thought I was ready to agree to. And I was fortunate enough to get in on that deal early on. But, they didn't limit themselves to just Northeast Ohio. So I think as an entrepreneur, it's nice to be able to do it in your own backyard because there's a cost in trying to go out and raise money. I mean, there's a lot of time involved, time that's being taken away from trying to build your product and grow your customer base.
You mentioned that your focus or the deals that you like to invest in more really just stem kind of from technology and the lower marginal cost of distribution. But I think that you've taken kind of an industry agnostic approach, investing across technology, healthcare, real estate, media. And again, tying it back to Cleveland, what have you kind of seen as the drivers of change in the city over the last decade? You've spoken to how it's changed and how it's stayed the same in some ways. People really often point to healthcare as where a lot of the innovation and progress and technology is at play here in Cleveland. I'm curious your perspective on that as well.
Healthcare, obviously, people gravitate towards it here because of the clinic in UH, and they cast a big shadow. So we're really fortunate that Northeast Ohio, we've got these world-class healthcare facilities. And, there's ideas being spun out of there quite often. And so that's kind of the natural thing everyone sort of wants to gravitate to. But there's also, obviously manufacturing, cornerstone of Northeast Ohio for generations, I guess you want to think of it that way. And I think that's, probably where, our other strength lies. I think there's just a lot of very, very smart people here in Northeast Ohio, hardworking, not flashy. You can get things done here. The nice part about Northeast Ohio is it's a small community, and if you've got a good reputation, then, it'll open a lot of doors for you. On the downside, if you don't have a good reputation, you're not going to really get a lot of traction. You might have to move. In the last, say, 10 years, I think, I'm not really sure that we've moved the ball in a significant manner. But, we've had more successes. All the efforts that have been put forth over the years has had a positive effect. I think the entrepreneurs I come across, I think, are more realistic. I don't see really any get-rich-quick kind of schemes where entrepreneurs put a business plan together and their sole kind of, they are more motivated by having a, big exit than actually solving a problem. The entrepreneurs I talk to are really more about building a great business than having an eye on an exit as soon as possible. We always say that, if you run a profitable business or, at least break even, we like businesses that can get to break even fairly quickly, because then you have a lot more flexibility. And if you run that kind of business, you'll always be able to find an exit,
When you think about great businesses, and I imagine, dozens, hundreds that you have had the opportunity to meet with and potentially invest in over the past few years, what are the ones that got away from an anti-portfolio perspective? Are there ones that in retrospect you wish that you had different information at the time or thought about differently? And I would love to hear your retrospection on maybe some of the ones that got away.
Yeah, I don't think there's any one that I had the opportunity to invest and I didn't because of I missed it. I didn't think of it in those terms. That thought process. There's a bunch of them that I wish I got into but didn't have the opportunity, like Explorers for one. I think Steve McHale is one of the smartest guys I've ever come across, and Charlie, of course. They're just really smart guys and again, they both have that kind of determination that they're going to succeed. So that's, Explorers is, one up there. Cover My Meds is another business that I didn't get an opportunity on. And of course, all the ones that were successful, I wish I was in on. But to be honest with you, I told somebody that, say when Facebook was out raising money, if they had pitched me Facebook at the time, I might have gone, I don't think so. There's already MySpace, and they seem to be kicking ass. And, there's Friendster, social network for, college kids. I don't see it. That very well could have been my attitude, and of course, Mark Zuckerberg is a little quirky. And so I might have been turned off to that, or who knows. But there's not really anyone that I kind of look back on and kick myself for not recognizing.
To close out, a question that we like to ask everyone on the show as we try and map the land is for the kind of buried treasure that you have in Cleveland. What is your kind of favorite hidden gem of the city that you appreciate?
A hidden gem? Gosh, I'm not sure if there's a hidden gem, but I think the metro parks are probably our greatest asset, even more so than the lake. I mean, the lake is fantastic, but most people don't have access to the lake, but the metro parks are just a phenomenal resource and asset to Northeast Ohio. My niece has a fantastic gallery in the Colonial Arcade called W Gallery, and she does a fantastic job. She's a jewelry designer and, studied in Italy and represents a lot of different artists. And so I think that, if I, really thought about it, and of course I'm biased, but I think it's a wonderful shop and a great place to meet artists and, pick up unique items.
All right, Lee. Well, if people have any questions or things that they would want to follow up with you about, where's the best place for them to find you?
And they can reach out to me on LinkedIn, although, if they have a question, they can reach me on LinkedIn. I never accept people's offers to connect on LinkedIn unless I've met them in person or done business with them. But they can send me an email to lzapis@zapiscapital.com. And, with any ideas, I'm happy to give advice to anybody who is seeking it. And with the caveat that it's, it's free advice. So, it's maybe not worth much, but it's, I'm happy to look at people's decks, give them feedback on their investor pitch. If it's something that they think would be of interest to me, we like elder care. We've been in that business for 30 some years. Our family, media, of course, is I always think of myself primarily as a media marketing guy. We like software as a service, B2B stuff. And I would much rather invest in a business development professional that had an idea for a product, but maybe didn't have the funding or know-how on how to develop it, than a product person who's developed some really awesome, or at least what they think is an awesome thing, but has no idea on how to sell it.
Lee, thank you so much for coming on and sharing your story and your background. Really appreciate having you on the show.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Nice talking to you.
That's all for this week. Thanks for listening. We'd love to hear your thoughts on today's show, so shoot us an email at layoftheland@upside.fm or find us on Twitter at podlayoftheland, at @thetegan, or at sternhefe, JEFE. We'll be back here next week at the same time to map more of the land. If you or someone you know would make a good guest for our show, please email us or find us on Twitter and let us know. And if you love our show, please leave a review on iTunes. That goes a long way in helping us spread the word and continue to help bring high-quality guests to the show.
Jeff and I decided there were a couple of things we wanted to share with you at the end of the podcast. And so, here we go. Tegan Horton and Jeffrey Stern developed the Lay of the Land podcast in collaboration with the Up Company, LLC. At the time of this recording, we did not own equity or other financial interests in the companies which appear on this show unless otherwise indicated. All opinions expressed by podcast participants are solely their own opinion and do not reflect the opinions of Founders Get Funds and its affiliates or Actual and its affiliates, or any entity which employ us. This podcast is for informational purposes only and should not be relied upon as a basis for investment decisions. We have not considered your specific financial situation nor provided any investment advice on this show. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you next week.